Thank you, Forward Festival, for inviting me here today to talk to you about my work as an illustrator, designer, and artist. My voice is a bit out of breath because I got stuck in the traffic jam. I think there's a marathon in town, and we had to run through the park, so I'm a bit hyperventilating. But my work is defined mostly as illustration, design, and art. And when I started my career 15 years ago, I always had difficulties making people understand what I exactly do, because I illustrate, but I don't draw. I design illustrations, and I'm an artist, but I work commercially. And even last night, when we had our speakers' dinner, a colleague asked me whether what I do, and I said, I'm an illustrator, and he's like, oh, so you draw? And I'm like, no, I don't actually draw. I use common materials to transport my ideas. In the media, sometimes when people talk about my work, they find new definitions for it. For example, Sarah Illenberger is an art director. She's a photographer, set designer, stylist, a prop designer, paper artist, food stylist. In Germany, somebody called me a Sachbearbeiterin, a professional Bastlerin. Bastlerin is a very common used name, which is a craftsman, a multi-disciplinary artist, or a visual storyteller, which is my favorite. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter to me, because I think the process is always pretty much the same. So I start off coming up with an idea, unluckily not by rubbing my nose, but by going through the whole tedious process of researching, of drawing, of reading, surfing the internet, or just taking long walks, or lying awake at night in bed and trying to come up with an idea. Actually wearing a hat sometimes helps, because I feel like my thoughts kind of stay together. I bring that idea to the client, to the magazine, or advertisement, or just to myself, and as soon as that's nodded off, I try to execute it in my studio in Berlin, where I work together with one or two assistants. And when the technique is more complex than we can actually produce, I outsource it and use technically skilled people like this neon glass blower who works naked in the summertime because it gets so hot in the studio, in order to produce images which then end up in wonderful magazines like the Zeit magazine. And so the artwork turns into a two-dimensional illustration. Either it's printed and sometimes also used in installations in physical spaces. I started as an illustrator 15 years ago just because illustration was for me the most free and open kind of segment or discipline in the design world. In definition, illustration actually does not mean more than just to shed light on something. So I felt that using materials in everyday surroundings instead of paint or paper was my way of communicating. And during that time, if somebody asked me, what would be your dream job, I always looked at magazines and supplements, and I thought being a journalist, but using images instead of words would be my dream profession. So I started working for a magazine called Neon. That was 10 or 12 years ago, when they just founded their office in Munich, targeting a younger audience between 20 and 35. And I basically made myself very unuseful as a graphic designer. All my layouts were always, just trashed out immediately, and I had no feeling for typography and all of that. So at the end, I was in charge of creating ideas, which 2 or 3 of these ideas I produced myself, and the other ideas I gave to other artists. And that was really great training for me to see editorial design from the other perspective, and to really understand what you need, how many images you need, what ideas you need for a cover, and what the whole kind of systematic is behind editorial design. So after 5 years, I realized that Neon magazine was limiting me, and I felt that I had to express my language to a wider kind of magazine audience. So I went to Berlin and I set up a studio and I started working for all kinds of international magazines and creating images which always evolved around the use of materials and the use of craftsmanship. I think my illustrations can be defined usually as symbolic. I like to combine very simple symbols like this filleted pig, which I just downloaded on Google Images, and then to combine it with a very complex kind of technique. In this case, I think the biggest challenge was to convince the butcher that he should hand out 10 or 20 different slices of meat, all packaged separately, which kind of causes irritations at times, but he did at the end. Another kind of pattern that I follow is that of conceptual illustration, which is kind of to combine two worlds. So for this text, the author wrote about how different vegetables always get fashionable, or how restaurants suddenly all cook with the same kind of fruits and vegetables. And so I merge two worlds, like taking two foils on top of each other and moving them so long until they kind of create a new image. And in that case, it was like a dress that I made out of vegetables and salads. The choice of materials in my illustration is very important to me, and I feel like each material kind of has its own quality and texture. And this essay about the boom of wellness hotels and the boom of kind of everybody wanting to be like cocooned and soft music and all of that, it was published in the Süddeutsche Zeitungsmagazin, and I created this cover using a very obvious symbol for the zeitgeist of well-being, and then kind of transforming it into a soft knitted brain. And here again, I used my grandmother's help actually to produce it. The basis for all of my illustrations is the inspiration and the observation of my kind of everyday life. And I studied in London, which really helped me kind of learn from English people and learn from English artists, I think, to kind of see your everyday surrounding in a bit kind of distant and humorous way. I mean, we all know that the English are very humorous, so I thought it would be, well, I realized that that really kind of affected my way of seeing my surrounding, and I'm kind of like a hunter and gatherer of things that are kind of failed or kind of errors. On the top right, you can actually see the Café Havelka 10 years ago. I was there with my cousin and realized that the D was missing on the toilets for the ladies. And so I have this huge archive of images which I always refer back to when I'm looking for an idea. Many ideas just luckily stay in my head and at some point find the project or kind of the briefing which they fit for execution. Execution sounds so terrible. I have to find another word. So one of these observations, for example, which turned out into a very kind of bigger story, was a row of pencils on the table back in the office of Neon magazine. And just by the fact that they were shaved in different length and all aligned on the same level kind of made me think, this could also actually be a bar chart, like a statistical diagram. And then I went a step further, and then I thought, why is it always that these kind of statistical diagrams are so dull and so dry, and that you're never actually really evolved in reading them and finding out what the information is one's trying to communicate? So I took it a step further and I went to the chief editors and I said, why can't we do a survey on all of these kind of issues and thoughts, religion, beliefs of our generation, or I think they said that actually, and bring that together in a kind of new visual language. So I got this big book of evaluations and informations, and I picked out like the 10 most interesting facts and also the most challenging. The first one was, are you happy with the way you look? And 63% are pretty happy about the way they look, whereas 2% are very unhappy. And finding a symbol, I think, to show beauty in a subtle and not too obvious way was quite challenging. The same as the middle question is, how often do you masturbate per month? Yeah. And I think 22% is a big radish. They masturbate 1 to 3 times. And the last one with balloons was about plastic surgery and whether you would be shocked if your partner was confessing to you that he's actually done some physical corrections, and 72% actually wouldn't mind, which was quite surprising, I thought. So this was a story that kind of derived from seeing things in my everyday life surrounding. And after more work editorially, I started being approached by advertisement clients. It's, I think, the normal course of things that after some years of editorial work, advertisement catch up and want the same kind of visual language. So Nike asked me to create an image for the anniversary of the Dunk, the, I think, iconic trainer, turned, I don't know, 10, 20 years. So I kind of approached this project in the same way, and I started collecting all the symbols and all the objects which are inside this kind of street culture world, what Nike actually stands for and what this trainer stands for. So I collect these materials on the flea markets. I go to eBay, obviously, and markets and Skips, and Amazon is a good place sometimes to find all these things, although they're not so politically correct. Well, and so I bought all this material. I think usually I buy like double the amount, and I puzzled it together in order to create this shape. And unlike a puzzle where you always have like a right and a wrong, there are obviously very many versions and options this can go to. So at the end, I really keep things like until the end deadline, until I make a final decision. And other clients, for example, the watch producer Nomos, they always send me the material beforehand, or I really ask them to send me the original product, so I can really play around with it and also kind of lose my respect for it, because I think most of my work, what can be seen is that there's never like this feeling of, oh God, this is food, this is precious, I can't treat this like a piece of paper. I kind of have a very democratic way of approaching a material, even if it's an expensive watch or a door handle. In this case, a company called FSB sent me a huge box of door handles and like sanitary devices and asked me to come up with a concept. And luckily there was a lot of time involved and a lot of trust also on the side of the agency, so I could really start playing around with these elements. And I slowly, like over a period of, I don't know, 2 weeks maybe, I realized that all these shapes resembled like a skeletal system, and how could a skeletal system be photographed in such a way that it can be actually, intriguing to buy. So lots of accidents happened in my studio, and suddenly this kind of dinosaur evolved, and we created a whole campaign based on evolution. And I think this kind of process is really important in my work, because I feel that too often the agencies come with like a finished briefing, a finished storyboard, using all the moods from your friends and colleagues, and think, can we do something like that? And sometimes it's good just to please them and tell them, yeah, sure, we can, but actually I have a better idea, and then to always leave a bit of space and room to create something that they were not expecting. So this was a good example for that. And it was photographed as a campaign, but then also for a little art installation in Berlin for the design week. They wanted me to rebuild the whole dinosaur, or it was a whale at the end of the day, in the studio. And this is basically where this work as like more my installation work began. It's like 10 years ago maybe, when more and more clients asked me to produce work that's physical, real, people can, walk through it, touch it, feel it, smell it, like approaching all the senses, and having something that's only that's a one-off, exclusive just for that space. And I was quite surprised because on the same hand, it was this time when suddenly everybody was on Facebook, on Instagram, and all these social media platforms were opening. And then on the other hand, this pretty large demand for these unique installations, either in windows. I did this window for Alster House, which is this huge department store in Hamburg. They wanted me to do a 2-in-1 installation. The first was the opening, and the second was Christmas. So I thought, how can I combine opening, Hamburg, and Christmas? So thinking of the word, in German you say Segelbaum, it's like this kind of tree, which I then turned into what it is, and then at the end they all became Christmas trees, just by using buoys, these kind of plastic balls which represented Christmas trees, and some lighting, green lighting. And I think this project also really shows how I always like to enter new worlds, and I'm always intrigued by collaborating with craftsmen who are specialized in certain fields. And in this case, it was a sailmaker at the Wannensee in Berlin who helped me create the whole production. And he was super happy finally producing something out of the box, something a bit more free and artistic. And I was obviously very happy not to have to, sew these 8-meter long sails. And in a similar way, I kind of got into the world of parades. I don't know if you've ever seen these beautiful parades in California. There's one that's called Rose Ball, and whole villages kind of get together before this event, and there's a competition going on who can create the most beautiful float. So with that in mind, I pitched for a presentation for Hermes. They had an opening in the KaDeWe in Berlin, and the briefing was to kind of celebrate the move from Paris to Berlin. So I made these 10 different floats which carried the iconic products, and I used paper, not because it's super versatile and super easy to use, but also for economic reasons. I think there's no there's no material that can be used in so many different ways and so many different techniques as paper. So we got together on this project, and I think that's 6 years ago, and since then every year I produce one window for MS. And this was the latest one, and it's, I think, one of the most special window projects I've done. I approached there's a institute or like a workshop in Kreuzberg in Berlin for disabled people, and they have a whole department just on brush making. And brush making is a really like a dying breed in the whole world, because it's obviously all been replaced by machines, and and factories, but there's this group of great people who made these amazing natural landscapes. I mean, all this grass on the bottom, it's all handmade, each single horsehair and grass made from cacti pulled through these holes, and they created this fascinating landscape. And additionally, I also asked a hair artist from Africa to make these wild animals. And she produced these and the wild buffalo for the window. And to get a nice impression maybe on how the production looked behind.
Ich heiße Sarah Illenberger, bin Illustratorin, Designerin und Künstlerin. Wir arbeiten hier im Auftrag von MS an der Dekoration von Schaufenstern für 11 Geschäfte in 10 Städten. Wir haben mit der Behindertenwerkstatt in Kreuzberg, Berlin zusammengearbeitet, weil es eine der letzten Bürstenbindereien in Deutschland ist. In der Recherchephase bin ich wirklich mit dem ganzen Studio im Botanischen Garten gegangen und haben dort Pflanzen live angeschaut. Die Grundidee war es, eine Steppenlandschaft aus Pinsel, Bürsten und Besen zu kreieren. Spannend wird es immer dann, wenn meine Installationen mit der Produktwelt von Hermès eine Symbiose ergeben. Der magische Moment ist eigentlich immer die Interaktion zwischen der Installation und den Passanten, wenn die eigenen Entwürfe auf die Wirklichkeit treffen.
A really great production company in Berlin who did this video, and it was, I think, it was clicked online, I think, at least 5,000 times, which brings me back to the beginning when I mentioned that, strangely enough, internet, digitalism, and the need for physical installation suddenly had such an importance. I think all results back to the fact that these installations are always photographed so commonly on mobile phones and then spread all over the world and the web. And suddenly I think there's such an impact there, and the power of the medium kind of multiplies the visibility of these artworks, which is very much in my favor. And but at the end of the day, what's always very frustrating is that these artworks get thrown away. There's a policy, for example, at MS that they have to discard everything that's been produced. I think the animals were sold and used for charity, but basically I can't also, keep everything and save everything. So I had a moment where I thought maybe there's a possibility of kind of reproducing illustrations in such a way that becomes a design piece, and I can sell it and people can actually use it, and it has a function. And so many illustrations that I did, for example, this was a handheld mirror for an essay for the New York Times on vanity and narcissism in the social media. I then translated into a handheld mirror, which I sell on my shop and in other shops. The cover for the Libération Festival Guide was the basis for a series of lamps that I'm been producing with a lamp maker in Berlin. Or a little photograph that I took of my daughter's marbles last summer ended up on a plate as dishware for children. So a lot of objects kind of changed their functionality and not longer only an image but also a usable device. These combs are actually made in Vienna. The really great comb maker, I think one of the last comb makers worldwide. And these rubbish bins or waste bins were just made out of pure necessity because I couldn't accept myself using IKEA paper bins in my studio. And other objects and pieces which just kind of celebrate the banal and the beauty of the everyday, and just kind of, maybe also like a pop art idea of taking something so common like the lilo and then making it into leather and using it as a daybed. So I'm just giving my work maybe a bit more time, lifetime. And in the same way, I started printing my artworks with a fine art printer, just because I was fascinated by the idea that people actually live with your work. And if you work for magazines for a long period of time, you get really frustrated that it all ends up in the waste bin. So I opened editions and I started creating my own series of work. And I started with just taking food and vegetables and kind of going through the word, or going through what they graphically kind of symbolize, and working in a serial way on different fruits and vegetables. And they became quite popular, so some other people actually thought, why not just copy it? Found this quite interesting. It was quite sweet because so many people on Facebook and in the internet kind of still keep mailing me and kind of find these melons somewhere and say, you can't accept this, you can't accept this to happen. And at the end of the day, there's unfortunately not much one can do about it, except directly mailing H&M, for example, and ask for your fee, but doesn't really help. So I created an artichoke, some rubies, all these different fruits and vegetables, I think also based on the fact that my dad used to have a restaurant, and I spent my whole childhood playing in the backyard, playing with food. And then I opened a web shop. Luckily that wasn't too complicated, and I started selling my images all over the world. And the beauty of that is really that sometimes people mail me and they say, oh, I saw this image, I know you're not, you don't have a limited edition print of it yet, but could you open one, because I want to give this to the doctor who saved the life of my child. In this case, it was friends of mine where the child had a heart problem, and they gave this image to the surgeon. And on the right, the image was, I think, a symbol for a card, an engagement card for somebody who wanted to surprise his loved one. Following that, I had my first exhibition in Berlin. Pictures are so out of focus. Oh, sorry about that. And it was nice to see people actually kind of understanding that my work is all made by hand. And still sometimes I think people think, you did that in Photoshop, or is that CGI? And I'm like, nope, go see my exhibition. And that kind of brought me, after this food, working with food instead of paper and working with natural materials, I started working more and more with like flowers and plants. I don't know, I just think there's something in it, and I experiment around, and I spent, I think, 2 weeks in my studio just experimenting with plants, and at the end I came up with this idea that flowers actually look a lot like fireworks. So I called them the flowerworks, and I bought huge bunches of flowers and I arranged them in such a way, photographed them in a tent, so they looked like firework. And I got a really positive feedback on this, not really knowing that there was such a political message behind it, and that many people kind of felt these images were a symbol of peace, and this whole kind of aggression of real fireworks, and that they should be banned, and that this was such a nice kind of alternative way of thinking, and thinking a bit more positive and optimistic. So I used that chance to go to Portugal for 2 months. That was 2 years ago, and I rented a garden studio, which was very beautiful, and kind of I went offline as much as I could, except for the moment when I ordered, I think, a huge box of tapes from Modulor in Berlin, and they FedExed it over to me in Porto. And I stole some leaves and botanical gardens, and I just started applying these tapes and graphical images onto these leaves and photographed them under the sunlight, and realized that the world is actually very small, or that you can make it very small. You just have to have a good internet connection and your imagination and a camera, and you can actually work everywhere. And while I was working on this series of images, I still started looking for other images which just happened around. I went to the market every day and I found this fish. It was also very difficult to make the woman understand that I just want the head of the fish and not the fish itself. And just finding and hunting for materials that felt they had another meaning or had a more symbolic story to tell, more poetic kind of meaning. And much of my work is also to do with coincidences, just things that happen by chance, like this stone which kind of disappeared in its background. And last year I applied for my first art residency. I went to Italy to a place called Villa Lena, and it was a 2-month program where they offered you just a very huge kind of old horse stable, and you could just do what you want. And most artists, I think, had kind of a mission and had a plan in mind what they wanted to do, but intentionally I kind of set out to do something that I couldn't plan. So I just went there kind of open-eyed and thought what's something that I could do here that I can't do anywhere else. And I started collecting things on my walks and my hikes around the studio, and I just put it together in these kind of ikebanas, freestyled still lifes, and just realized how beautiful it is when you're like, you have more space and you have more, space around you that kind of affects the way you work, and that this kind of sitting at your desk in the city just makes your work look and gives it a certain style. So I really took the advantage of it to kind of spread out and be a bit more open and less, orientated to a result. So I kind of let myself go, and I invited a friend of mine who's a violinist, and together we set up a concert. It was called To the Birds, inspired by John Cage. And I built these instruments very simply out of everything that I kind of found, and she played those instruments, and we had a very beautiful concert. So kind of stepping, across my own kind of boundaries has really brought me to other places which feel really important to me. And other places is something I've been practicing the last years, really going to places and looking what's there and kind of being curious. In this case, I communicated with some camel owners, and he rented the camel to me, and luckily I had some rescue blankets with me, which I cut into lametta and photographed and filmed this funny camel. I think people appreciate it because it had such also again, a kind of a political feeling on, keep calm and carry on, and that's my work. I hope you liked it. Thank you. Thank you.